Somewhere around the middle of this month, part of the country is about to feel like autumn showed up early. Not everywhere. Not a nationwide deep freeze, not anything dramatic enough to make headlines about record cold. Something quieter, and in its own way, stranger. A stretch where people from the Great Lakes down through the deep south step outside expecting the usual thick, oppressive August air, and instead get something that feels unmistakably like September. Meanwhile, at the exact same moment, on the other side of the country, nothing changes at all. The heat just keeps sitting there, parked, unbothered, like the atmosphere itself decided to split the country in half and hand out two completely different seasons on the same calendar day. That split is the real story here, and it's worth understanding properly, because the honest version of what's happening is more interesting than the exaggerated one. This isn't a coast-to-coast temperature collapse. It's something more specific, more regional, and if you actually look at why it's happening, a pretty good window into how a single shift in the upper atmosphere can completely rewrite the weather experience of half a continent while leaving the other half exactly where it started. Picture the map for a second, because it actually tells the whole story before a single number gets involved. Draw a rough line down the middle of the country, and for the next week or two, you get two entirely different versions of August playing out simultaneously on either side of it. One half easing towards something that finally feels breathable. Windows cracked open in the evening for the first time in weeks. The other half locked in exactly the same relentless heat. It's been dealing with since June, with no sign of that changing anytime soon. That's not a metaphor. That's roughly what the atmosphere itself is set up to do over the coming days. And understanding why one side of that invisible line gets relief while the other doesn't is worth actually walking through. Let's start with what's actually being forecast, because the details matter here more than the drama. According to the most recent extended range forecast guidance, a strong pattern shift is expected to send noticeably cooler air sweeping down out of Canada into the central and eastern United States over the coming days, while the western half of the country remains locked under a warm ridge of high pressure that has no intention of budging. The coolest stretch of this pattern is currently projected to fall somewhere between roughly the 12th and the 20th of this month, though it's worth being upfront about something forecasters themselves are upfront about. At this range, a week or more out, these kinds of projections can still shift. Long-range forecasting isn't the same as tomorrow's forecast. It's closer to reading the general shape of a pattern before all the fine details have locked into place. And the meteorologists producing this specific outlook have said as much themselves. Here's what makes it worth paying attention to anyway. This isn't the only signal pointing toward the country's weather pattern shifting. In the days leading up to this outlook, cold fronts had already started behaving a little unusually for the time of year. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a genuinely rare early August cold front pushed through, and local meteorologists specifically flagged it as unusual. Not because it delivered some dramatic temperature crash, but simply because a cold front of any real definition showing up in Louisiana in early August isn't something that happens most years at all. It mostly just knocked the humidity down for a couple of days, but the fact that it happened here, in the deep, sticky heart of a Gulf Coast summer, was itself a small preview of the broader pattern change building behind it. Around the same time, in western Wisconsin, another cold front slid through, pulling temperatures down out of the mid-80s and setting up several days of noticeably drier, more comfortable conditions before the next warm-up was expected to build back in. Individually, neither of those events would mean much. Cold fronts pass through the country constantly, even in summer. That's simply how weather works. But taken together, they're consistent with something larger organizing in the atmosphere. A pattern where the jet stream, the fast-moving river of air high above the surface that steers weather systems around the globe, dips further south than usual across the central and eastern United States, dragging genuinely cooler Canadian air down behind it, while a persistent ridge of high pressure holds firm out west, blocking that same cool air from ever reaching the Pacific states, the Southwest, or the Rockies. This is worth explaining properly, because it's the actual mechanism behind everything else in the story, and it's not complicated once you picture it correctly. Think of the jet stream as a wavy line running across a weather map, undulating north and south as it crosses the country. When that wave dips southward, meteorologists call this a trough, it pulls colder, more northern air down with it, because the air on the north side of that dip is coming from higher latitudes, closer to the Arctic. When the wave bulges northward instead, meteorologists call that a ridge, and a ridge tends to trap warm air underneath it, the same basic mechanism behind a heat dome, just usually less extreme and more short-lived. Right now, the pattern being forecast places a trough over the central and eastern United States and a ridge sitting out west. That's the entire explanation for why one half of the country is about to feel like a different season while the other half doesn't notice any change at all. It's also worth being honest. about how this fits into the bigger picture of what the official government forecasting agencies are actually saying, because there's a real and interesting tension here worth sitting with rather than glossing over. The National Weather Service's Climate Prediction Center, which issues the official 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day outlooks for the entire country, had actually favored warmer than normal conditions across most of the United States heading into the middle of this month based on their own most recent guidance. That's not a contradiction so much as a reflection of exactly how uncertain and fast-moving extended-range forecasting can be. A pattern that looked more likely to stay warm just days earlier can shift meaningfully as new model data comes in, and long-range private forecasting services sometimes catch a signal building in the data before it's fully reflected in the most recent official short-range guidance, while other times those early signals simply don't pan out at all. That tension, official near-term guidance leaning one way, longer-range model trends suggesting something different building behind it, is a normal, honest part of how forecasting actually works, not a sign that anyone got it wrong. It just means the picture for the middle of this month is still coming into focus, and it's worth watching how it evolves over the coming days rather than treating any single outlook as the final word. So what would this pattern actually feel like on the ground for the people living through it? Nothing approaching a freeze, nothing close to record cold. This isn't a story about frost warnings in August. It's a story about relief. For people across the Ohio Valley, the Appalachians, the Northeast, and even down into parts of the Deep South and Southeast, the forecast points toward daytime temperatures easing back from the oppressive mid to upper 90s that have defined so much of this summer into a range that would feel genuinely comfortable by comparison. Highs more typical of a mild September afternoon than a peak of summer scorcher, with humidity levels dropping enough that stepping outside stops feeling like walking into a wall of wet heat. For anyone who's spent the past several weeks sweating through an unusually intense, prolonged stretch of summer heat, a shift like that isn't a curiosity. It's the first real break in months, but that relief comes bundled with its own complications, because the same atmospheric setup driving the cool down is also expected to produce repeated rounds of thunderstorms and heavy rainfall. This is where the story stops being simply pleasant and starts requiring some real attention. When a sharp temperature contrast sets up between cooler air pushing south and the warm, humid air still sitting in place ahead of it, that boundary becomes an active zone for storm development. Not a single dramatic, severe weather event necessarily, but a recurring pattern of frontal systems sliding through one after another, each one capable of producing locally heavy rain, gusty winds, and the kind of storm activity that can catch people off guard specifically because it keeps repeating rather than clearing out after one round. The zone forecasters are specifically watching for this kind of repeated storm activity, stretches from the Ohio Valley into the Appalachian region and up into the Northeast, with the Southeast and Gulf Coast expected to remain one of the more consistently active weather regions in the entire country through this stretch. That's largely because of where the boundary between the cooler air and the lingering warm tropical moisture ends up settling. Abundant humidity is expected to keep lingering along the east coast, even as cooler air pushes in from the north and west, and where those two air masses collide, cool, dry air advancing from one direction, warm, moisture-loaded air holding its ground from the other, you get exactly the kind of setup that produces repeated waves of heavy rain and thunderstorms, sometimes over the same areas multiple days in a row. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first, because repeated rounds of rain over the same region carry their own specific risk, separate from any single storm's individual intensity, saturated ground. When the first round of heavy rain soaks into the soil, that soil has less capacity to absorb the next round that follows a day or two later. Instead of soaking in, that second or third wave of rain increasingly runs off the surface, filling creeks, storm drains, and low-lying roads faster than the ground can handle. This is exactly the mechanism behind a lot of flash flooding. That doesn't come from any one dramatic storm, but from the cumulative effect of a pattern that simply won't stop producing rain over the same general area for several days running. So even as the headline temperature story here is genuinely good news, real relief from a stretch of oppressive heat, the secondary story sitting right behind it is a legitimate reason to keep an eye on rainfall totals and any flood watches or warnings issued for your specific area over the coming week to 10 days. It's worth spending a little more time on the western side of this split too, because nothing changes is a less interesting sentence than the reality underneath it. A ridge of high pressure that refuses to budge for a week or two doesn't just mean a continuation of warm, pleasant weather. In the specific parts of the interior West already dealing with drought conditions, an unmoving ridge means continued limited rainfall, continued stress on already dry vegetation, and continued elevated fire weather risk, all while a genuinely different set of concerns dominates the conversation a couple thousand miles to the east. That's part of why flattening a story like this into a single nationwide headline does a disservice to people on both sides of that line. The version of this pattern that matters in Boise or Salt Lake City is entirely different from the version that matters in Louisville or Charlotte, and neither one is well served by a forecast that only tells half the story. Meanwhile, out west, none of this changes anything. The same ridge of high pressure that's been anchoring hot, dry conditions across the western half of the country is expected to hold its position, meaning states across the southwest, the Great Basin, and much of the interior west should expect their summer weather pattern to continue largely uninterrupted. No cool down, no relief, just a continuation of whatever heat and dryness has already defined their summer so far. That's an important piece of honesty to include here because a headline promising temperatures crashing across the country would genuinely mislead anyone living in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, or Denver into expecting a break that simply isn't part of this forecast. If anything, some of that same interior western ridge has been directly tied to the ongoing drought and elevated wildfire risk that's persisted across parts of that region for much of the summer, and nothing in this particular pattern shift is expected to meaningfully change that. It's worth putting this in some historical context too, because a mid-August cool down of this shape isn't unprecedented, even if it's genuinely uncommon enough to be worth noticing. Weather records from previous years show similar late summer pattern flips happening on occasion. A cross-country cold front arriving after a stretch of unusually intense heat, delivering a sharp, if temporary, temperature drop before conditions gradually rebound over the following days. In one such case, from earlier this year, forecasters described a stretch of record-challenging heat giving way to a sharp temperature drop within the span of just a few days, driven by a very similar cross-country frontal setup, though that particular event unfolded in springtime rather than the heart of summer, and it carried an added frost risk for gardens and blooming plants that simply isn't part of the picture this time around. The mechanism connecting these events is the same even when the season and the specific consequences differ. A strong enough push of cooler air from the north, combined with the right upper-level pattern to guide it southward, can reshape the weather experience of a huge stretch of the country within the span of just a few days, regardless of what time of year it happens to be. There's a genuinely interesting piece of atmospheric science buried in this split, worth explaining a little further, because it's the kind of thing that makes weather patterns like this one more than just a list of temperatures. Ridges and troughs in the jet stream don't just sit still, they're part of a much larger wave pattern that circles the entire globe. And when one part of that wave amplifies, meaning the ridge gets taller and the trough gets deeper, it often does so at the expense of flexibility elsewhere in the pattern. A strong ridge parked over the western United States can act almost like a wall, deflecting the jet stream and the cooler air riding along with it, away from that region entirely, forcing that same cooler air to dive further south and east than it might otherwise, which is part of why a pattern like this one can deliver a genuinely noticeable cool down to the central and eastern U.S., while the west stays locked in place. It's not that the cold air weakened before it could reach the west coast. It's that the ridge itself is actively redirecting where that cooler air is allowed to go, funneling it down through the middle and eastern parts of the country instead. This is also a good moment to explain why this kind of pattern shows up more dramatically in some years than others, because it isn't purely random. The overall shape and amplitude of the jet stream, how sharply it dips and rises as it crosses the country, is influenced by a range of larger, slower-moving climate factors, from the state of the polar vortex to broader oceanic patterns that shift over months and years rather than days. In some summers, the jet stream stays relatively flat and fast across the country, delivering a fairly consistent, uniform weather pattern coast to coast with only modest day-to-day variation. In other summers, including apparently this one, the pattern becomes more amplified, with deeper dips and taller ridges, which is exactly the kind of setup that produces sharper regional contrasts. Genuine relief in one part of the country arriving at the same moment as unchanged, entrenched heat in another. It's worth pausing to note how this fits into the broader shape of the summer as a whole, because this cool down isn't happening in isolation. It's arriving on the heels of an unusually persistent multi-wave heat pattern that's defined much of the season so far. Earlier this summer, a heat dome settled over the eastern United States and eastern Canada, driving weeks of well above normal temperatures, before a second heat dome formed over the western half of the continent shortly after. That extended stretch of heat has already been tied to dozens of confirmed deaths across North America, underscoring just how serious sustained heat waves actually are, even without any single day standing out as historically extreme. Against that backdrop, a genuine multi-day cool down across the central and eastern U.S. isn't a minor curiosity. It's a meaningful, welcome interruption in a pattern that's already proven capable of real harm, arriving specifically for the region that's spent the most consecutive weeks dealing with it. For anyone specifically in that Ohio Valley to northeast to southeast corridor, there are a few practical things worth actually doing with this information, rather than just noting it and moving on. If you've been putting off outdoor plans because of the heat, yard work, a hike, an evening outside with family, this stretch is a genuinely good window to take advantage of, particularly in the earlier part of the cooldown before the heaviest rain chances build in. At the same time, it's worth checking your area's flood history and drainage situation now, before the rain actually arrives, rather than in the middle of a downpour. If you live near a creek, a low-lying road, or an area that's flooded before during heavy rain, this is the kind of pattern. Repeated rounds of rain over the same saturated ground that has historically been responsible for exactly that kind of localized flooding, even without any single storm standing out as unusually severe on its own. And if you're the kind of person who tracks rainfall totals or flood watches for your specific county, this is a stretch worth actually checking in on day by day, rather than assuming that because the headline story is a pleasant cool down, there's nothing else worth paying attention to underneath it. There's also something worth saying about how easy it is to misread a forecast like this one if you only catch the headline version of it. Temperatures crashing across the country sounds like something everyone should brace for, uniformly, no matter where they live. The reality? A meaningful welcome cool down for roughly the eastern half of the country, arriving alongside a real risk of repeated heavy rain and localized flooding, while the western half of the country continues on exactly as before, is a more accurate, more useful thing to actually know, even if it's a little less dramatic to say out loud. Overstating a forecast doesn't just risk making the story sound more exciting than it is. It risks leaving someone in Seattle or Phoenix expecting relief that was never coming, while someone in Ohio or North Carolina braces for something more extreme than what's actually likely, potentially missing the more relevant detail. That the real thing worth watching in their specific area isn't the temperature at all, it's the rain. So what should someone living inside this affected zone, roughly the Ohio Valley, the Appalachians, the Northeast, the Deep South, and the broader Southeast, actually take away from all of this? First, genuine welcome relief from an unusually hot, humid summer is a realistic expectation over the coming week to 10 days, with daytime temperatures and humidity both easing back into a range. That should feel noticeably more comfortable than what's defined most of the season so far. Second, that same pattern comes with a legitimate secondary risk worth tracking specifically: repeated rounds of thunderstorms and heavy rain, arriving along the boundary between the incoming cooler air and the lingering warm, moist air already in place, with the potential for those repeated rounds to produce localized flash flooding, particularly if the same general areas end up getting hit by multiple rounds of heavy rain over a short span of days. And third, if you live in the western half of the country, this particular story simply isn't about you. Your summer weather pattern is expected to continue largely unchanged, heat and all, regardless of what's happening a couple thousand miles to your east. It's also worth remembering, as this pattern actually plays out over the coming week or two, that long-range forecasts like this one are best understood as an evolving picture rather than a locked-in certainty. The broad shape of the pattern, trough in the east, ridge in the west, active storm zone along the boundary between them, is a genuinely well-supported signal at this point, consistent across multiple pieces of evidence, from the specific frontal passages already observed in Louisiana and Wisconsin to the broader jet stream configuration meteorologists are watching build in the models. But the finer details, exactly how cool it gets in any specific city, exactly which days see the heaviest rain, exactly how long the cooler stretch actually lasts before the pattern flips back toward more typical late summer warmth, are the kind of specifics that genuinely do refine and shift as the event actually approaches. And that's not a flaw in the forecasting process. It's simply an honest reflection of how much more precisely the atmosphere can be read 3 days out compared to 10. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this too, about how to actually read a weather story instead of just reacting to its headline. The most useful version of a forecast like this one isn't the most dramatic version. It's the most accurate one. Even when accuracy means admitting the story is regional instead of national, welcome instead of alarming, and still evolving instead of fully locked in. A cool down that brings genuine relief to millions of people after weeks of oppressive heat, while simultaneously raising a real, specific flood risk that deserves its own separate attention, is a more useful thing to actually understand than a vague, sweeping claim that temperatures are about to crash everywhere at once. The real story here isn't smaller because it's regional. If anything, understanding exactly where the relief is heading, exactly where the risk is building alongside it, and exactly who this pattern simply doesn't apply to at all, is what actually lets people in the affected zone plan for it properly. Swap out plans for an outdoor evening that finally doesn't feel unbearable. Keep an eye on the rain forecast for the same stretch, and not spend energy worrying about a nationwide event that was never really coming in the first place. There's one more angle worth sitting with before wrapping this up, because it says something about how weather stories in general tend to get told versus how they actually unfold. The instinct to reach for the biggest, most sweeping version of a forecast, temperatures crashing everywhere, a nationwide event, something that applies to everyone listening no matter where they live, is understandable. It's simpler to say, and it feels more urgent, more shareable, more worth stopping to hear about. But actual weather almost never respects that kind of tidy, universal framing. It moves in waves and boundaries, ridges and troughs, regional splits that leave one town bracing for flooding, while a town 400 miles away barely notices a cloud in the sky. The more honest version of any weather story is almost always the more specific one. Not, this is happening to the whole country, but this is happening here, for these reasons. And here's what it actually means if you live in this specific stretch of it. That version takes a little longer to explain. It's also the only version that actually tells you something true enough to plan your week around. Because that's ultimately what makes a story like this genuinely worth paying attention to, rather than the exaggerated version of it. It isn't a countrywide weather emergency. It's something a little more specific and honestly a little more human. A long, hot summer finally showing the first real signs of loosening its grip across a huge stretch of the country, arriving on the back of a jet stream pattern that's been building for days, bringing welcome relief bundled together with a real, worth-watching risk of heavy rain, while an entirely different set of Americans, a couple thousand miles west, keep living through the exact same summer they've had all along. Understanding both halves of that story, rather than flattening it into a single dramatic claim, is what actually lets you know what to expect where you live. And that, in the end, is what a forecast is supposed to do in the first place.